The world moves in shadows, nations rise and fall, empires stretch forth their hands to grasp power, yet all eyes, whether knowingly or unknowingly, turn toward a small strip of land, no larger than the size of a fingerprint on the map of history. Israel, ancient yet living, fragile yet unbreakable, stands at the center of an unfolding drama written long before kings wore crowns or armies marched across the earth. It is here, in the dust and stone of Jerusalem, that destiny is bound together with prophecy, and it is here that the tremors of coming upheaval send ripples across the earth. The nations plot, leaders gather in secrecy, alliances are forged and broken, yet in their councils of power, they cannot escape the unseen force drawing them toward confrontation with the God of history. For thousands of years, the prophets declared that Israel would not vanish, that even if scattered among the nations, the people would be gathered again, and the land would once more bear fruit. Against all odds, in the ashes of exile and the smoke of persecution, Israel has risen again. A living testimony that prophecy is not poetry, but reality. Not myth, but a sharp blade cutting into time itself. And because of this, the nations tremble. They do not understand fully why, but they sense it. Something about this land and this people shakes their thrones and disturbs their plans. The powers of the world, whether great or small, measure themselves not only by armies and wealth, but by their stance toward Israel. History has borne witness to this truth. Those who sought to crush Israel were crushed themselves. Those who sought to scatter her found themselves scattered. And those who blessed her were lifted up in ways they could not comprehend. Pharaoh hardened his heart, and Egypt was broken. Babylon raised its towers high, but its glory fell into dust. Rome spread its legions across the earth, yet in its pride it cast its shadow against Jerusalem, and centuries later Rome's glory is ruins, for tourists to walk through while Israel lives again. How can this be, except that prophecy has declared it so? The nations tremble not only at Israel's resilience, but at the reminder that there is a higher hand directing history, one they cannot manipulate or silence. In the corridors of power, today, in Washington, Moscow, Beijing, Brussels, and Tehran, Israel is discussed not merely as a political question, but as a fulcrum of global tension. Every war in the Middle East, every peace accord, every uprising and negotiation seems to circle back to this land. And why? Because prophecy has declared that Jerusalem will be the cup of trembling to all nations, that those who burden themselves with her will be cut in pieces, though all the nations of the earth gather against it. Leaders may not quote the prophets, yet unknowingly they walk in the very script written thousands of years ago. Each decision, each alliance, each move of armies across borders draws the world closer to that prophetic convergence. Israel's existence is more than survival. It is confrontation. It confronts ideologies that deny the divine. It confronts the arrogance of empires. It confronts the ambitions of rulers who imagine themselves sovereign. For in Israel, the eternal question resounds: who rules history, man or God? The rebirth of Israel answers it with thunder. God rules. And yet, the nations tremble not in reverence, but in defiance, for trembling can lead to two paths: humility or rebellion. Too often, history shows that trembling nations choose rebellion. They arm themselves, they conspire, they raise their voices against Israel, thinking that by opposing her, they can resist the hand that guides her. But prophecy has warned them. Though they rage, their rage is vanity. Though they plot, their plots dissolve. The trembling of the nations is not merely political or military, it is spiritual. Deep within the conscience of mankind, there is a recognition that Israel's story pierces through time, that her survival exposes the futility of man-made kingdoms. The return of a scattered people to their ancient homeland after 2 millennia is not a coincidence of geopolitics, it is the unfolding of divine decree. Empires could not erase it, ideologies could not silence it, the Holocaust itself could not extinguish it. Out of the darkest night, Israel rose again, a miracle written in flesh and blood, a sign to the nations that the God of prophecy is not silent. Yet instead of awakening to this reality, the nations tremble in confusion and pride, groping for answers, grasping at weapons, and raising banners of defiance. In the days ahead, the trembling will increase. The Middle East will not settle into calm, for prophecy has already spoken that it will be the epicenter of shaking. Alliances will shift like sand in the wind, nations that once seemed stable will collapse, and powers that once seemed invincible will find themselves staggering. And at the heart of it all stands Israel, surrounded, pressured, scrutinized, yet upheld. The world asks why this one nation refuses to fade, why its enemies rage yet fail to erase it, why its very existence keeps the world in tension. The prophets already answered, because Israel is the signpost of God's plan, the living evidence that He governs history, and the stage upon which the final acts of the age will unfold. The trembling of nations is not without reason. It is the prelude to confrontation. The prophetic word speaks of a day when the nations will gather, not by accident, but by compulsion, drawn like moths to flame, into a conflict not merely with Israel, but with the God who chose her. The shaking of economies, the instability of governments, the unrest in societies, all are tremors of the greater shaking to come. For prophecy declares that once more God will shake not only the earth, but also the heavens, so that what cannot be shaken may remain. Israel's survival has already shaken the world. Her role in the days to come will shake it even more. The trembling of the nations is felt not only in the war rooms of generals and the speeches of leaders, but in the very streets of their cities. Civil unrest, economic instability, and a growing sense of fear whisper through the air like a storm. Approaching, the powers of the earth boast of their strength, but inside they are shaken. They sense, though they may not say it aloud, that history is converging on a point, that the hourglass of time is running out, and that Israel stands as the sign of what is soon to unfold. When Israel fights a war, markets quake in distant continents. When her leaders speak, policy shifts across oceans. When her enemies rise, alliances reshuffle in panic. Why does such a small nation carry such weight? Because prophecy has made her the fulcrum of destiny, and the world cannot escape her significance. Consider the great superpowers of our age. America, long a supporter of Israel, finds itself torn internally, divided by voices that question its allegiance. Within its borders, political chaos and moral decline echo the fall of empires past, and yet its stance toward Israel continues to shape its fate. For prophecy is not neutral, it blesses and it judges. Those who bless Israel find themselves lifted, those who curse find themselves diminished. Already the evidence is clear. Nations that sought to harm her no longer exist in the same form. The Ottoman Empire, once vast and powerful, collapsed into fragments. Nazi Germany, which swore to annihilate the Jewish people, lies buried under the weight of its own destruction. The Soviet Union, which persecuted Jews and barred them from their ancient homeland, fell into pieces like dry clay. And yet Israel lives. She not only lives, but thrives. Her technology, her agriculture, her culture shining out far beyond her size, a paradox the nations cannot solve. And because they cannot solve it, they tremble. Russia eyes the Middle East with calculation, seeking influence, seeking access, seeking to restore its stature on the world stage. Yet prophecy has spoken of northern powers drawn into a final conflict, of nations that will align themselves against Israel in the valley of decision. The trembling is not only in Israel's enemies, but in her so-called allies, for alliances, built on politics, not conviction, will not endure the storm that is coming. Leaders change, promises break, treaties dissolve, and yet the prophetic word stands unshaken. Israel will remain. China watches from the east, a rising empire with ambitions stretching far beyond economics. Its belt and road winds through deserts and seas, yet even its eyes turn to the Middle East, where oil, trade, and influence intersect. But it does not understand that the true treasure of the Middle East is not oil nor trade, but the spiritual weight of Jerusalem. And as it seeks to expand its shadow, it too will find itself trembling. For prophecy declares that all nations will be drawn into the tension of this land, whether willingly or unwillingly. Europe, once the crucible of Christendom, now weakened by secularism and internal strife, seeks peace in words but cannot find it in reality. Its cities are restless, its unity fragile, and its leaders cautious. Yet even Europe cannot escape the trembling. For though it may desire neutrality, prophecy does not allow neutrality when it comes to Israel. Nations will be forced to choose, and in that choice, their destinies will be sealed. The Middle East itself is a furnace of tremors. Iran, with fiery rhetoric and dreams of wiping Israel from the map, builds weapons in defiance, not realizing that prophecy has already sealed its fate. It rages, it funds proxies, it stirs conflict, but it does not know that the very hatred it breathes is drawing it toward destruction. The surrounding nations, whether hostile or cautious, find themselves in constant turmoil, their regimes fragile, their people restless, their futures uncertain. Yet amid all their shaking, Israel stands. Pressured, yes. Threatened, yes. But not destroyed, never destroyed. For the word spoken over her is everlasting, and so the nations tremble, because deep within they know this. The story is not about them. Their power, their empires, their histories are chapters in a larger book, and that book centers on Israel. They are not the authors of history. They are characters swept along by a plot far older than their crowns and constitutions. Pride blinds them, ambition drives them, but prophecy overrules them. And so they rage, but their rage is futile. They tremble, but their trembling is the sound of prophecy being fulfilled. The trembling grows louder as wars loom, as economies falter, as natural disasters intensify, as morality collapses. The earth itself seems to groan, as though creation knows what is approaching. Prophecy declared that in the last days there would be wars and rumors of wars, earthquakes, pestilences, and signs in the heavens. All these converge now with startling clarity, and in the center, Israel remains the key. For if you want to understand the times, look to Israel. If you want to discern where history is headed, watch Jerusalem. For the city that has been contested, more than any other, will soon be the epicenter of the final confrontation, and the nations know it, even if they deny it. That is why they tremble. Jerusalem, the city of peace, yet the most fought-over city in history, stands as a paradox that exposes the weakness of human wisdom. The United Nations debates endlessly over her status, yet prophecy has already declared her destiny. Nations send ambassadors, negotiators, and armies to shape her future, yet prophecy has already sealed her fate. They tremble not because they control her, but because they cannot. No matter how many resolutions are passed, no matter how many threats are made, no matter how many wars are fought, Jerusalem remains under the hand of the one who declared, "I have set my name there forever." The nations tremble because their power breaks against her like waves against a rock. The trembling of nations is not merely external, it is internal, a shaking of conscience and a stirring of fear that no military might can silence. Leaders sit at long tables, their hands folded, their advisors whispering strategies. Yet in the depths of their minds a question lingers that they cannot speak aloud. Why does this one people, this one land, this one city stand at the center of everything? Why, when borders change across the globe, when empires rise and collapse, does Israel remain unshaken? Why do their plans fail, their campaigns falter, their schemes unravel when they turn against her? They cannot voice it, for to do so would be to admit that there is a God who governs history, and that realization would demand humility. And pride is the crown of kings and rulers. To remove it is to strip themselves bare. So instead, they tremble in silence, covering their unease, with speeches of strength, while prophecy marches forward unbending. Israel's existence is more than a national story. It is a mirror held before the nations. In her survival, they see their own mortality. In her restoration, they see their own fragility. In her ancient prophecies fulfilled, they see the exposure of their false hopes and fading ideologies. Israel declares, without speaking, that man is not the master of time. She is the living testimony that promises made thousands of years ago have outlasted pharaohs, emperors, generals, dictators, and presidents. Her survival is not an accident, it is a rebuke, and so the nations tremble. Look at the deserts that have blossomed under her hand, fields that bloom where once there was dust, technology that flows from her borders into the very devices and systems the world uses daily. Even those who curse her still benefit from her breakthroughs. This paradox unsettles the proud, for how can a nation so small, a people once scattered, produce what the mighty could not? The answer is hidden in plain sight. Prophecy declared that when the people returned, the land would give forth its fruit, and the desert would bloom like the rose. What is seen today is not human ingenuity alone, it is prophecy alive, and the 8 nations tremble because they cannot stop it. The trembling grows in the shadow of conflict. Enemies mass on Israel's borders, launching threats, firing rockets, raising armies. Yet time and again, they fail to erase her. Each war, instead of ending her, has only confirmed her. Each attack, instead of weakening her, has strengthened her resolve. This is no ordinary resilience. It is the echo of ancient words. No weapon formed against you shall prosper. And still the enemies do not learn. They continue, driven by hatred, blinded by pride, thinking that sheer numbers, sheer power, sheer rage can undo what God has decreed. But the trembling exposes their weakness, for in their attempts to destroy Israel, they destroy themselves. The nations tremble because they are caught in a snare they do not see. Prophecy declares that those who gather against Jerusalem will be like men wounding themselves, cutting their own flesh in their frenzy. The more they rage, the more they bleed. The more they plot, the more their plans collapse. History repeats this truth over and over, but blindness remains. Pharaoh learned it in the Red Sea. Haman learned it on the gallows he built. Antiochus learned it in his downfall. Hitler learned it in his bunker. And yet the spirit of defiance rises again in new forms, in new nations, in new leaders who think they are different. But they are not. They are walking the same path, and the trembling is the sound of their steps as they march toward the same end. Yet not all trembling is fear of destruction. Some trembling is awe. For among the nations are those who look at Israel not with hatred, but with recognition. They see prophecy fulfilled before their eyes and tremble in reverence, knowing that history is not random, that a higher hand is moving events. They look at the gathering storms and understand that the shaking is not chaos, but purpose. They tremble, yes, but with the trembling of those who know they stand on holy ground. For Israel is not only a sign of judgment, but also of hope, not only of confrontation, but of covenant. And those who see it, who understand it, find themselves aligned not with the rage of nations, but with the plan of God. The nations tremble too, because they sense what is coming. Deep within the collective consciousness of the world, there is an unspoken knowledge that history is rushing toward a climax. Wars are not isolated, disasters are not random, collapses are not coincidences, they are birth pangs of something greater. The ancient prophets spoke of it. A day when nations will be gathered, when Jerusalem will become the epicenter of conflict, when the armies of the world will stand in the valley of decision. Even those who do not read the prophets feel it in their bones, sense it in the unease of the times. They speak of global instability, of a world order collapsing, of crises piling one upon another, but what they truly feel is the trembling of nations as prophecy draws them toward its appointed hour. And Israel stands, not merely as a participant, but as the sign. Her very existence shouts to the world that time is shorter than they think, that history is converging faster than they realize. Every headline that features her is a reminder that the clock is ticking. Every alliance made against her, every threat spoken, every rocket launched is one more step closer to the inevitable confrontation written long ago. The nations tremble not because they understand fully, but because their spirits sense that something beyond their control is unfolding. And control is what they crave most, yet here it slips through their fingers like sand. In the coming days, the trembling will become shaking. Nations that once seemed immovable will totter. Economies that seemed unshakable will collapse. Leaders who seemed untouchable will fall. Prophecy speaks of upheaval so great that men's hearts will fail them for fear. Yet in the center of that storm, Israel will remain, battered but not broken, surrounded but not consumed. She will remain because her destiny is not decided by the trembling of nations, but by the word of God, and that word stands forever. And so the trembling of the nations will not cease until the final word is spoken. History is a river, and that river has always flowed toward Jerusalem. Kingdoms have risen like mountains, only to be reduced to dust, yet Israel has endured as the immovable stone in the stream, unmoved though waves crash against it. The nations rage, they conspire, they draw their swords and raise their banners, yet their trembling betrays the truth. They are not the masters of their destiny. They are actors upon a stage set long ago, playing roles foretold by prophets, who spoke when the empires of today were not even dust in the wind. Israel stands not because of might, not because of alliances, not because of politics, but because she was called, chosen, and preserved. The covenant spoken over her outlives every throne. And though the nations tremble in anger, though they plot to erase her name from the earth, they only fulfill what was written. For prophecy declared that all nations would gather against Jerusalem, and in that gathering they would meet not merely a city, not merely a people, but the God who placed his name there. Their trembling is the drumbeat of a coming confrontation, the thunder before the storm, the warning before the fire falls. The leaders of the world believe they hold the pen of history, but history itself is written by the hand they cannot see. They speak of peace yet prepare for war. They speak of security yet sow instability. They speak of a future yet cannot control the next breath of their empires. And in their trembling, the truth stands exposed. They are fragile, but Israel is eternal. They are temporary, but her covenant is everlasting. They tremble because deep within, they know their power cannot outlast the word of prophecy. Jerusalem, the city of destiny, will not bow to their decrees. Nations will rise, armies will march, alliances will form, and the earth will shake. But Jerusalem will remain. She will be the stone too heavy to lift, the cup too bitter to drink, the fire too fierce to quench. And in the end, the trembling will reach its peak when the nations find themselves face to face with the one they have denied, the one who wrote the story, the one who declared from the beginning what the end would be. The trembling of nations is not the end, it is the beginning of the end, for prophecy speaks of a day when swords will be broken into plowshares, when war will be no more, when the nations will come not to rage against Jerusalem, but to walk in her light. But before that dawn comes the storm, before peace comes the shaking, before restoration comes judgment. And so the trembling will intensify until every throne is humbled, every pride is shattered, every voice of defiance silenced. Only then will the nations learn what Israel has always declared. The Lord reigns, his covenant stands, his word cannot be broken. And as the nations tremble, as leaders plot, as armies gather, one truth resounds above the noise. Israel stands at the center of prophecy, and the trembling of the nations is proof that the hour is near. The kingdoms of this world are passing away, but the purposes of God endure forever. The trembling is not the collapse of prophecy, it is its fulfillment, and in the end, when the dust settles and the voices of men fade, Israel will remain, Jerusalem will shine, and the nations will know that the word spoken long ago was true. The nations tremble because prophecy lives. They tremble because the end of their pride is written. They tremble because the King is coming.